All right, Jabosai, good morning. Let us begin. So begin by thanking our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Teves, Dovi and Nina Elman, for dedicating all of the Shurim and Drashos this month in honor of their daughter Ayelet becoming a Bas Mitzvah. May she continue to be a source of nachas for the entire family. Beautiful Daf Yomi sponsor today, Rabbi and Masha Sarah Lowenstein, in honor of their precious Shadchan, who went above and beyond to bring them together, with much continued Akaras Atov to Dr. Mark Lustman. This is Dr. Lustman's second dedication this week, quite beautiful, for this incredible journey of married life. We virtually celebrate our anniversary with you, wishing Mark and Elsa only health and happiness. Truly beautiful from the Lowensteins. Incredible. All right, so we'll say with that, let us begin. So we are picking up today. Today's daf is daf mem. We are picking up in Meretz Hashem at the Mishnah on Lamed Tesam Beis 39b. So the Mishnah says as follows: Ein shorin as hamarson l'tanagolin aval choltu. We don't soak bran. So we'll say, now literally again, it's for chicken feed. So we don't go ahead and soak bran for chicken feed. Aval cholton, but we scald. Now we'll say, now what this means over here, Rashi points out over here that by cholton, beroschin shein manichin oso lahachmitz. So scalding bran literally means you would go ahead and drop bran into scalding water. What that does is it cooks it, but it cooks it instantaneously. There's no possibility for chimutz, no real possibility, ultimately again, for a chametz process to occur. So the Gemara says, avacholten ha'isha lo sishres hamorsan shetolich biyada lemerchatz. Similarly, again, a woman should not go ahead and soak bran in order to take it with her to the bathhouse. So this apparently would be using bran as a type of soap, a type of cleansing agent. Aval shafahi bivsara yavesh, but she could rub the bran against her skin when it's dry. In other words, I will say the idea would be over here, even though after she's bathed, so her body, her skin has moisture, we're not concerned about that moisture, right? That moisture that's on her body after she goes in and bathes, that moisture is not problematic. Lo yilos adam chitin v'yaneach hamakaso. So similarly, again, a person should not chew on wheat and put it on his wound. Ultimately, again, because the wheat becomes chametz. So we'll say, again, the idea over there being that the saliva, a person would chew up the wheat, put it on their wound. You don't do that because it could become chametz. Good. Says the Gemara Tan Rabbanan. These are the items that cannot become chametz. Ha'afoi v'hamavushol v'chalot shecholtu b'roschin. Something that is baked, something that is cooked, and something that is scalded in hot water, which seems to be indicating once something is cooked, right, in some fashion, then halacha l'maaseh it doesn't have the ability to become chametz anymore. Mevushol, what do you mean it can't become chametz when it's cooked? As you're cooking it, it could become tamei. So what does that mean? What it means is something that was baked, that you subsequently cooked, cannot become chametz. So as Paul says, it's almost like by Hilchos Shabbos, we see like ein bishal achar bishal, right? Once something is cooked, it's not subject to any further cooking process. So in a similar way, once something is cooked, it is no longer subject to the chimutz process. Tanya Rabbi Yosef Yehuda Omer, Kemach shenafa l'sochol dlaf, afilu kol yom kulo eino bali dechimutz. What's an interesting halacha? Rabbi Yosef Yehuda says that if you have flour and there is water dripping into that flour, even if the water is dripping in the entire day, the flour will not become chametz. Will not become chametz. So the Gemara qualifies this statement. Amar Papa v'huda avid tif lahade tif. Rav Papa says this is only if there is a perpetual drippage, right? Only if there's a perpetual, because we both said this goes back to what we said yesterday, that or a few days, or maybe it was on Sunday, that technically speaking, the chimutz process only begins when the manipulation of the dough or of the flour stops. So technically speaking, if you're kneading a dough the entire day, the dough doesn't become chametz. So too the Gemara suggests that if you have water dripping into flour and that water is constantly dripping. It's constantly dripping, so there's a constant movement, in the flour does not become chametz. Da amri deber b'shila vatiko yesh shari. So we'll say, so the Be'er B'Shila, they said this food item, vasika, is totally permitted. Totally permitted. So the Gemara says, V'hatanya vasika aser. But we learned elsewhere that vasika is aser, to which the Gemara says, Lo kashya. Depends how you make it. Hadda avdei b'mishcha umilcha, hadda avdei b'maya umilcha. If you make vasika, which apparently is a flour dish, that is made so flour is the ingredient. The shaila is what are the other ingredients. If the other ingredients are oil and salt, it won't become chametz. But if the other ingredients are water and salt, it can become chametz. So this goes back to what we learned as well, that oil, remember again, is like mei peiros, and the Gemara is assuming fruit juices, and the Gemara is assuming that mei peiros einon machnitzin. So if the vasika is made with water, then it can become chametz. If it's made with oil, it won't become chametz. Amar Mar Zutra, lo limchi inish kedera b'kimcha da'avshina. What's an interesting halacha? A person should not go ahead and literally thicken a pot of food with flour, even if the flour has been baked in an oven. So we'll say, now watch this. So obviously, the notion of putting flour into a cooked dish in order to go ahead and thicken the dish, so that is something we certainly understand. I would have thought like this, based on what we just said before, once something is baked or something is cooked, it's no longer subject to a chimutz process. Well, if that's the case, then I would have assumed that halacha l'maisa, once I go ahead and bake the flour, then halacha l'maisa, there should be no problem of chimutz. I should be able to introduce it into a pot to thicken up the pot, to which the Gemara says, don't do that. Why? Dilma lo bashil shapir va'asi lidei chimutz. Because we will say, perhaps the flour was not fully baked, and because it wasn't fully baked, there are raw parts of it, and when you introduce it into the pot that's cooking, the unbaked part of the flour could potentially become chametz. Shabbos said this is actually a very interesting statement in the Gemara, because we're familiar with the minhag of gebrachts, right, where people will not go ahead and eat matzah with any type of liquid, and the concern of, so it's strange, at first glance, it's a strange minhag. In other words, what are you concerned about? Matzah is baked. The concern of the minhag of gebrachts is that perhaps, again, there's an unbaked packet in the matzah, which then, if it comes in contact with liquid, could become chametz. Just pointing out something very interesting, that this concern already traces its way back to the Gemara, right? So you even have Mar Zutra over here talking about baked flour, right? Baked flour, and telling you, well, yeah, maybe you should be concerned that there's some part of the flour that remain unbaked, and therefore don't mix it into a pot. Good. Amrav Yosef lo lichlot inish trechiti top of mem bahadi adadi. A person should not go ahead and scald. So we're back to the process of scalding, dropping into boiling water. Person should not scald two pieces trechiti, literally again 2 wheat kernels together. What are we concerned about? Dilma azla chada v'yasva b'tzirei dechaverta v'lo salek lehu dikula demaya me'arbe ruchasa v'asi lidei chimotz. What's the concern? So a wheat kernel has like a little bit of an indentation, a cleft. So the concern is that if you're scalding 2 wheat kernels together, what happens, or what could happen? One kernel could settle into the cleft of the other, thereby preventing the boiling water from accessing that area of the cleft. If that happens, then it could turn out that one part of the kernel remains uncooked. And because it remains uncooked, ultimately it could become chametz. So you must remember again, the whole idea with scalding is that because scalding is instantaneous, there's no concern of chimutz. But obviously, if some part of the kernel itself is not accessing the water, or the water is not accessing some part of the kernel, that's where there could be some type of concern regarding chimutz. V'amra Abaye, lo lichroch inish trei shiboli behadi hadadi. Abaye said a person should not go ahead. Lichroch literally means to singe. To singe 2 stalks of grain together. Why? Dilma nafki maya mehai ubala idach va'asya lidei chimutz. Because maybe one stalk will go ahead and have liquid which emerges from it, and the other stalk will absorb that liquid and come to chimotz. Amrali Rava, so Rava said, Ihachi afilu chadanami dilma nafik mihai reisha bala idach reisha. So Rava says, well, if that's what you're concerned about, you shouldn't even roast one stalk of barley, because maybe what's going to happen that it's going to excrete some liquid, and that same stalk could go ahead and reabsorb that liquid. Ella Amar Rava says, rather, we're not really concerned about that. Me peiros ninhu. See, I will say, when you have stalks of grain or barley or kernels of grain, and they excrete some type of liquid, interestingly enough, that liquid actually has the status of me peiros, fruit juices, and therefore, even if it is reabsorbed, halacha lamaisa, it does not pose a problem. Me peiros in machmitzin. V'hader be Abaye meahi. And Abaye ultimately again retracted this. Why? Because anything flowing from an item itself, ultimately again, this is two things. In other words, any liquid that comes out of the item is not going to cause that same item to become chametz. Furthermore, again, any liquid that flows, that is not stationary, is not going to cause chimotz as well. Damra Abaye, haychatzba da'avshina sichifa. This particular barrel that we go, I should say, chatzba da'avishuna. This particular barrel that you go ahead and you use to roast kernels in an oven. So you put the kernels in the barrel, put the barrel in the oven, you would roast the kernels. What's talach? Sichifa shari. If the barrel is literally either upside down or on its side, then it's permitted for use. Because I will say, then the assumption is whatever liquids come out are going to flow out to the barrel and will not collect in the barrel. Zikifa, but if the barrel is upright, ultimately again asur. Because then there's a concern that halacha lamaisa, the liquids remain trapped inside and could cause chimotz. Rava amra afilu zikifa nami shari. Rava said even if the barrel is right side up, it's still not a problem. Why? Me peiros ninu. Because remember, any liquid that comes out of an item has the status of meiperos, and meiperos do not have the ability to create chimut. So meiperos einon machmitzin. Good. Tan Rabbanan ein losisin sa'orin bepesach. I will say second wide line mem amud aleph. Now I will say just to explain our terms. We had the term lichlot. Lichlot meant to scald. Here losisin means to soak. See, I will say it would be very common that they would soak grain. They would soak grain in order to remove the bran and any of the impurities before going in and processing that grain. So here the Braisa is saying, in losisin sa'orin bepesach, we do not soak barley. We do not soak barley on Pesach. Vim lasas, and ultimately again, if you did soak barley on Pesach, nisbaku asuros lo nisbaku mutaros. If the barley kernels literally opened up, nisbaku means burst, like if they began to open up as a result of the moisture, then they're going to be asr, because that's a sign of chimotz. Lo nisbaku, but if the barley kernels did not go ahead and open up, then mutaros. Ultimately, again, they will be mutar. Rabbi Yossi says, shoren bechometz som sasan. So that's very interesting. Rabbi Yossi says, if you see that the barley kernels are opening up as a result of being soaked in water, no problem, put them in vinegar, and apparently the vinegar causes them to contract. Amar Shmuel, in halacha Rabbi Yossi. Shmuel says the halacha does not follow Rabbi Yossi. We don't employ this vinegar trick. Amar Rav Chisda, Amar Ukva, lo nisbaku mamish. So when we say that the barley kernels are problematic, it doesn't literally mean that they opened up. Ella kol she'ilu manichin al ga'api chavis ve'hin nisbakos me'elehen. Rather, it means that if the barley kernels got to a point where if you were to now go ahead and put them on a wine barrel, that they would ultimately again open up because of the scent of the barrel of the wine, that's when the barley kernels would be problematic. Shmuel says, nisbaku mamish. Shmuel says, no, it's only a problem if you ended up soaking the barley kernels. It's only a problem if mamish they opened up as a result of being soaked, because we'll say the opening up of the kernels is indicative of a chimutz process. Avod Shmuel avda Bedura debei bar chashu nispaku mamish, and Shmuel conducted himself again in accordance with his psak halacha. There was a case that came up, Bedura de bar chashu, in the city of bar chashu, and Shmuel again allowed the soaking of the kernels as long as they did not actually open up. Good. Amar Rabba bal nefesh lo yilsos. So interestingly enough, so Rabba says a bal nefesh. Rashi points out this is a chassid. A chassid, someone who is a chassid, or in Hagos v'tziyunim they change it to Yorei Shamayim hachared al nafsho. Someone who is exceptionally pious. Therefore, Rabba says, Lo Yilsos, he should not soak any kind of grain on Pesach. Don't soak any kind of grain on Pesach. My area bal nefesh, I feel the kuli almanami. So the Gemara says, what do you mean bal nefesh? Only a chassid. The truth is, like we said before, really, no one should be soaking grain on Pesach. The Hasanya, because we learned, in losisin sa'orin bepesach. We do not soak barley on Pesach. Hachi kamar, this is what it means to say. Bal nefesh afilu chitin disheriri lo yilsos. So you'll say, interestingly enough, the Brisa framed this as talking about barley. But the Bal nefesh will not even soak chitin. He won't even soak grain, wheat. Wheat shouldn't be soaked as well. So the Gemara says, Bal nefesh afilu chitin disheriri lo yilsos. Shabbos say, apparently wheat is considered to be tougher than barley. So I might have, so again, therefore, on a technical level, there's really not such a problem with soaking wheat. The problem is much more with soaking barley. But a Bal nefesh, someone who's exceptionally frum and pious, shouldn't even soak wheat. Amar li Rav Nachman, man tzayis li la'aba, achal nama di'ipusha. So Rav Nachman said, whoever listens to Abba, right, whoever listens to Abba, ultimately, again, I will say, so Rav Nachman is saying is whoever listens to these opinions, well, he's referring to over here specifically Rabbah. Whoever listens to Rabbah is going to be eating spoiled bread. And I will say that if you don't soak your grain before you go ahead and you make your bread, so your grain is going to be of an inferior quality. So that's what he meant when he said whoever listens to Rabbah is going to be eating spoiled bread. You can't properly prepare bread without soaking the grain. Daha Bei Rav Huna l'sasi ubei Rava bar Abin l'sasi. So we'll say, because after all, again, he brings Rav Nachman brings examples that in the house of Rav Huna they soak the grain, in the house of Rava bar Abin they soak the grain. So there are many examples of good and pious and from people who soaked grain. V'Rava Amar Asra Lilsos, and Rava said, did Rava really say that it's not permitted to go ahead and soak grain? Elahad Desanya ein losasin sa'orin bepesach sa'orin hudalo ha-chiti shari. But we learned in a brayse that you're not allowed to soak barley. So it sounds like only the soaking of barley is problematic, but the soaking of grain is not problematic. Lomi bai kamar. Lomi bai chitin kevan de ispeit siri ayol beimaya. So we'll say, the Gemara says really what it means to say it like this. It goes without saying that one should not soak grain. Why shouldn't one soak grain? Grain has cracks in it. So because grain has cracks in it, the water could access it, and certainly it could become chametz. Aval sa'ari dishi emashapir, but I might have thought that barley, which is smooth, maybe there is no problem with going ahead and soaking barley. Kamash malano, kamash from that halacha lamaisa, there is a problem with soaking both barley as well as grain. Hada amarava, Rava came along and subsequently said, mutar lilsos. In fact, it is permitted to soak grain. It's getting a little confusing, right? It's permitted to soak grain. Tisanya, because we learned yotzin bepas nekia v'hadra. On Pesach, you are yotze, your obligation of matzah, whether you use pas nekia, clean, literally clean bread, or hadra, which means coarse bread. Now, I will say, not to be clear, pas nekia usually is made from flour where the grain is washed. Where the grain is washed prior to going ahead and grinding the wheat into grain. So the fact that the Gemara says that you could fulfill your obligation on Pesach with matzah made from which is pas nekia, indicates to us that grain can be washed on Pesach. To which the Gemara says, "Afshar nekia below l'sisa." You can't have pas nekia without first going ahead and without first going ahead and washing the grain. So Isvei Rav Papa l'Rava, so Rav Papa raised the kasha to Rava, Hakimachin v'hasalsos shal nachrim shal kfarim tahorim. So let's listen to this. The kemach, the flour, and the soles is the fine flour of nachrim, of Gentiles, shal kfarim, or of the villages, tahorim. Ultimately, again, are tahar. Now, but if you look at Rashi, Rashi says over here, shal kfarim tahorim. The fi she'in makpidin al solson la sosa nikia kolkach v'lo lasisi lechiti dido v'nimtza shaloch shuru. So this is very interesting. So the flour of the villages, they weren't careful to wash the wheat in the villages. So because of that, interestingly enough, there was never the presence of water. Because there's never the presence of water, remember again, we know that the halachos of Tumah dictate that in order for an item to become tummy, what has to happen? It has to have contact with liquid. Well, here, this flour of the villages never had contact with liquid, and therefore it's tar, v'shal krachin tmein. But ultimately, again, the flour that comes from the cities, that is going to be tamei. Why? Because that flour is in fact washed, and therefore, again, because it's washed, it comes in contact with liquid. Because it came in contact with liquid, therefore it's susceptible to tumah. The kfarim my time of the law. Why is it that the flour of the villages is not susceptible to tumah? Lab mishum de lo losisi. It must be because that again it's not washed, and yet vika karile soles, and yet halacha lemaisi. Even though the grain is not washed, it is still called soles. It is still called fine flour. To which the Gemara says targuma akimcha. To which the Gemara says, no. Don't assume that the when we were talking about that which came from the villages, in fact, that was a reference to kemach, to regular flour. The Gemara was not calling that soles, because in order to be called soles, fine flour, in fact, the grain would have to be washed before being ground up into flour. To which the Gemara says, Basar denafek amar mai taimalo emale meha. After he left, he said, I should have responded the following: the Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Amar Shmuel, chitin shal menachos ein losis inosam. That ultimately, again, the wheat of menachos are not washed. That wheat is not washed. And yet, v'kakarile soles. And yet, again, it is still called soles. So you see, Rabbi say there is an example where something could be called soles, and yet what? And yet halacha l'maisa not be washed. So Rabbi say, remember, we're focused really on a simple question over here, which is, can wheat used for Pesach, on Pesach, be washed in water? It was clear that normally they would wash wheat as a way of removing impurities and making a higher type, a better type of flour. The shaila just is, when it comes to Pesach, do we have to be concerned that the act of washing the flour could result in some type of chimutz process? Shabbos says, so far, almost all the sources we've seen seem to point in the direction of no. You cannot wash flour for Pesach, ultimately again, or on Pesach, because of the concern that it may become chametz. So to which the Gemara goes weiter, Hadar amarava mitzvah lilsos shene amar shmartem es hamatzos. So then Rava came along and said, no, in fact, it is a mitzvah to go ahead and wash the flour. This is incredible. So we'll say we've just gone from you're not allowed to wash the flour to it's a mitzvah to wash the flour. Why? Shenemar ushmartem es hamatzos. You shall guard the matzos. Now we'll say, now this is very interesting. So the Gemara says, what does it mean to guard the matzos? What that means is you have to guard the matzos from becoming chametz, which tells us that there's something in the process of making matzah that could cause it to become chametz, and therefore you have to guard it. So the Gemara says, "Ilo debay lisisa shimor lemay," and I will say, I understand now. This makes sense, as the Gemara suggests. If you hold that the grain is washed, then that's what requires shmira, right? Because halacha lemaisa, the grain is being washed, water is being introduced. The Torah says, guard the grain when you wash it. But ultimately, again, if you're not washing the grain, then where is guarding required? So the Gemara says, Ishim or Delisha, If you want to tell me, well, no, you have to guard the matzah when you need it, right? When you actually need the dough, that's when you have to guard it to make sure that it does not become chametz. Shimor delisha lav shimorhu. The guarding of the dough when you're kneading it is not called shimor. Now, what does that mean? Take a look at the first wide line of Rashi. Lav shimorhu, I lo avele shimor mikamehachi. See, I will say, you could guard the dough all you want during the time of kneading. But if the dough was not properly guarded before kneading, then what? Then halacha l'maisa, it could potentially become chametz. So it must be that the shimor, the guarding, that the Torah mandates by matzah is by lesisa, ultimately is by the washing of the grain. Dam Rav Huna, batzeko shel nachrim adam emalikrei samehen, o bilvad sheyochal kezayis matzah bachrona. So Rav Huna says, if you want to eat the doughs of nachrim, of goyim, you are permitted to eat as much Gentile dough as you want. Of course, provided it's not chametz, you can eat it as much as you want, as long as ubilvad sheyochal kezayis matzah bachrona. As long as at the end of your meal on the Seder night, you eat a kezayis of matzah. Bachrona in, so I will say, interestingly enough, it has to be your last consumption. Berishona lo, my taima, mishum delo avid v'hu shimor. Ultimately, again, I will say, look at Rashi for just a moment. Berishona lo kilomar ba'achila rishona shiachal mibatzeko shanachal lo nafik. Now I will say, so why is it exactly if these doughs that these wafers that I'm purchasing from Nachrim, if they're not chametz, why can't? Which obviously I'm eating them on Pesach, so they can't be chametz. So why is it that I can't fulfill my mitzvah of matzah with these Gentile crackers, with these Gentile wafers, these Gentile matzahs? It must be, I will say, because they're not made l'shem mitzvahs matzah. That's the reason. So I will say, it turns out the Gemara is explaining to us that halacha l'maisa, in order for an item to be usable for matzah, it is not simply enough that ingredient-wise you are sure that it's not chametz, but rather halacha l'maisa, it must also fulfill ushmartem es hamatzos. It must have been guarded l'shem matzah. And the Gemara is assuming right now that the guarding we're talking about must be when you soak the grain itself. If you soak the grain and you soak it and you guard it l'shem matzah, ultimately, again, that's the type of matzah you could use. So why don't we just say that you have to guard it from the time that you bake it and on? Elalav shmamina shimor meikara ba'inon. Rather, Rabbi say, you see from here that halacha l'maisa, you have to go ahead and guard the matzah from the beginning. Then I will say, just to be clear, so the Gemara, Rava is using this as a proof to show that not only are you allowed to wash the grain, but you have to wash the grain. It's a mitzvah. And when the Torah says, Ushmartem es hamatzos, that you have to guard the matzah, it's guarding it from the time of washing. That's the idea. Umimai, dilma shayni hasam, deba'idna dinaches l'shimor, lo avid l'shimor. Aval hecha deba'idna dinaches l'shimor, avid l'shimor. Hachanami d'shimor delisha havi shimor. So ultimately, and Abba says, so why don't you see over here? Once again, maybe halacha l'maisa. We're talking about the kneading. Maybe we're not talking about l'sisa, right? Maybe we're not talking about halacha l'maisa, guarding from water such early on, but rather again, hachanami d'shimor delisha havi shimor. Then maybe over here, it is guarding at the time of kneading. That's called shimor. Va'afilu hachi lo hader be'rava. But I will say, despite all of these arguments, so we'll say, remember again, the Gemara is unconvinced by Rava's logic. Right? Rava's logic is, Ushmartem es hamatzos, you have to guard the matzah, which I will say, we're going to see everyone in principle agrees to this idea, that you have to guard matzah. You have to guard it. What makes matzah's mitzvah for Pesach, is not simply the absence of chametz, but it's the fact that it's been guarded and prepared for the sake of the mitzvah of matzah. Rava wants to suggest that this shimor begins what he calls mishas l'sisa, from the time that you wash the grain with water. All the Gemara is just saying is, Rava, you have not conclusively proven that concept. The Gemara says, but nevertheless, afilu hachi lo hadr bei Rava. Rava did not retract his position that halacha lamaisa you have to guard the matzah even before kneading and even from the time of lisisa. To which the Gemara says, the amar luhu lahano de mahapri kipi. Because Rabbi he said to some people who were harvesting and bundling wheat during the harvest season, Ki mahafrisu hafichu l'shem matzah. When you turn over the bundles, turn them over ultimately again for the sake of the mitzvah of matzah. So Rabbi say this is actually very dramatic because now Rava's on record as saying that the matzah requires shimur, it requires guarding, almost like a lishma aspect, even earlier, right? Rabbi say up until now we were assuming that the Rava says that the matzahs have to be guarded mishas l'sisa, from the time that the grain is washed. Now we're seeing that Rava was telling the harvesters, when you go ahead and you harvest the bundles and you turn them over, when you turn them over, ultimately have in mind the shem mitzvahs matzah. Alma kasavar, therefore you see that the Rava holds shimor meikara mitchila sovat sofa ba'inan. I will say this is actually quite amazing. You see from here that Rava holds that halacha l'maisa for shmira, for matzos, shmartem es hamatzos, really requires the grain to be guarded, and to have a lishma dynamic to it all the way from the beginning. And I will say from the beginning sounds like from when? Mishas ketzira. From the time that the grain for shmura matzah, right, for matzah, is harvested, that grain must be guarded, and anything done for it really should be done l'shem mitzvahs matzah. Again, well, if we have time, we're going to see. I sent out the shulchan. We're going to discuss this. Mar Breid Rabina. So Mar Breid Rabina Amud Beis Minakto le'imei ba'arvi. So let's listen to this. So Mar Breid Rabina, his mother used to go ahead and gather for him grain or wheat from the beginning of the harvest season, and she would put it away for him, and he would use this grain to go ahead and make his matzah. So we'll say this is just another raya, just another proof to the fact that halacha l'maisa, grain used for shmura matzah really should be guarded mishas ketzira, should be properly guarded ultimately again from the time it is harvested. So the Gemara tells a story. Ho arba. Ho arba dechiti detava dechishta. There was a boat carrying grain, and the boat sank. The boat sank. Chishta, Rashi says, the name of a river. It sank in the Chishta river. Shabbos says, interestingly enough, what happened was as follows. They were able to go ahead and rescue some of the grain, but obviously the grain had been soaked in water. So what should you do with the grain? So Sharye Rava lizabune lenachrim. So Rava permitted them to sell the grain to Gentiles, to non-Jews. But interestingly enough, not to Jews. Most of this obviously was in proximity to Pesach. Not to Jews, because Rava felt that halacha l'maisa you can't go ahead and use wheat which was soaked. Eis vei Rabba bar Livai l'Rava. So Rabba bar Livai raised the kasha to Rava, and he said, "Beged sha'avad bo kilayim harei zalayim k'rel l'nachri." We'll say if halacha l'maisa you have a garment, and you know that in that garment there was some shatnez woven in, but you can no longer identify where in that garment there is some shatnez, you're not permitted to sell that garment to a Gentile. What are we concerned about? We're concerned that maybe the Gentile will resell that to a Jew, and the Jew will end up wearing clothing that has shatnez. Similarly, again, if the same garment, you can't make it into a saddle blanket for a donkey. But you can fashion it into burial shrouds, and then go ahead and sell those burial shrouds ultimately again to a mace for a nachri. So I'll say the idea being that once something is made for the dead and utilized for that, it's not usually repurposed for something else. So I'll say What's the point of this over here? My timer. So why can't I go ahead and if I have a garment, right? Remember again, shatnez is not asr no. So if I have a garment and I forgot where the shatnez is in the garment, so obviously I can't wear it, but yet the Gemara is telling me I can't sell it to a guy, or I can't go ahead and make it into a saddle and sell it to a guy. The only thing I could use it for are tachrichim for a mace. What's the pshat? To which the Gemara says, my time alone, lav mishum dahadr mizmin Yisrael. Because Rabbi say we're concerned that the Nachri will come to go ahead and resell it to a Jew. So Rabbi, why is the Gemara bringing this up? So too over here, if you feel that this wheat is problematic, if that's really what you feel, that because the wheat was in the water, it therefore was soaked, therefore it's problematic, why would you allow for the sale to a Gentile? Aren't you concerned that maybe the Gentile will go ahead and resell it to a Jew? To which the Gemara says, Hada Amarava, you're right. Lizbinu kava li Yisrael, ki hechi dekalya kame pischa. Rav Rabose in fact said, you're right. Instead, here's what I'd rather you do. Go ahead and sell it off in small measures. Kava means small measures. Just sell it off in small amounts to Jews. This way, again, the Jews will finish up the chametz before Pesach. That was the logic. They'll finish up the chametz before Pesach, and therefore it won't be a problem. So you both say, again, apparently Rava was only concerned about selling larger amounts. If you sell larger amounts, that's when there could be a concern that potentially the Jew might end up retaining some of this grain over Pesach. So therefore Rava said, just sell very small amounts, where we know whatever is bought now will be consumed before Pesach. Tan Rabbanon, ein molalin es hakadera b'Pesach. Shabbos say, we're not, Rashi says, molalin is bekemach kari malila kishenosin kemach latavshil. So Shabbos say, molalin means when you introduce grain into a pot of food in order to thicken the food. So the Brisa, we actually saw this before. So the Brisa says, we do not go ahead and put grain into a kedera, into a pot of food on Pesach. What's the concern about? As we saw before, the concern is that maybe some of the grain is raw, and by introducing it to the pot of cooked food, you may come to go ahead and cause the grain to become chametz. If you want to do this, no sinas hakemach ve'achar no sinas hachometz. If you do want to add grain, then the way to do this is first to go ahead and put in the kemach, put in the grain, put in the flour, I should say, shouldn't say grain, the flour, and then afterwards put in vinegar. So apparently vinegar stops the chimutz process. So if you introduce the grain and then you introduce the vinegar, you're good to go. V'yish omrim, others say, af no sinesa chometz v'achar kach no sinesa kemach. Others say the truth is the order actually isn't even all that important. You could first put in the vinegar and then put in the grain. The idea just is that it's the presence of the vinegar which impedes the chimutz process. Man yesh omrim. So tell me, who is this yesh omrim who says that the presence of vinegar will impede the chimutz process? Amrav chis Rabbi Huda. It's Rabbi Huda. This now because Rabbi Huda said ha'ilfis v'hakadera shavir mirusachin. So we'll say this is Hilchos Shabbos now. Ilfis is a frying pan, or a kedera is a pot. If you removed it from the fire and it is still hot, so remember again, for Hilchos Shabbos purposes, this is called a kli rishon. A kli rishon. So if you remove a kli rishon, which is the utensil in which the cooking took place, even if you remove it from the fire, if it's still hot, lo yitin l'sochan tavlin. You should not put spices into that pot. So I was like, because the idea is we hold kli rishon mevashal, that the primary cooking pot, the primary cooking utensil, in fact, does have the ability to cook, and therefore halacha l'maisa, even if it's off the fire, you should not go ahead and put any type of raw spices into it. However, abal nos in l'socha ki'ara o l'socha tamchui. Rabbi say what you can do is, once you go ahead and you transfer the contents of the pot into a dish or into a serving dish, then halacha l'maisa you can introduce any spices you want. Why? Because remember again, once you pour it out of the kli rishon into a second utensil, that second utensil is a klisheni. We assume that a klisheni doesn't have the capacity to cook, and it's not a problem. Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda on the other hand holds, so Rabbi Yehuda holds, la kol hu neosein, chutz midavar sheyesh bo chometz v'tzir. So we'll say, if you look at Rashi, la kol hu nosein, l'chol minei maichol hu nosein tavlin b'klisheni, chutz midavar sheyesh bo chometz v'tzir, shachometz mevashlan ba'achram shchol. So we'll say, it's very interesting. Rabbi Yehuda says that you're right. Once the food is in a klisheni, you could introduce whatever raw spices you want to, because the assumption is that a klisheni does not cook. But interestingly enough, Rabbi Yehuda says there's one exception to this rule. What's the exception to the rule? If the klisheni contains vinegar. If the klisheni contains vinegar or brine, then halacha l'maisa you can't introduce raw spices. Why not? Because apparently the vinegar and or the brine will cause the raw spices to become cooked. So Ravo say, what do you see from here? You see from here that according to Rabbi Yehuda, halacha l'maisa, vinegar has the ability to cook. So therefore, I will say, now remember, for Hilchos Shabbos, that poses a problem. Right? For Hilchos Shabbos, Rabbi Yehuda says, if you have vinegar in a klisheni, you cannot put any uncooked spices into that klisheni because the vinegar will cause it to be cooked. But what's problematic for Shabbos actually is what? Beneficial for Pesach. Why? Because now what did Rabbi Yehuda say? You could introduce raw flour into a pot of cooking food as long as what? As long as what? You have vinegar. Why? Because what does vinegar do? Vinegar goes ahead and essentially hastens the cooking process. In other words, it impedes chimutz by hastening the cooking process. Therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says, as long as you have vinegar in that pot, even if there's raw flour, it's not a chimutz problem. I benukma Rabbi Yossi, but why not establish like Rabbi Yossi? What does Rabbi Yossi say? This nan. Rabbi Yossi Omer shoran b'chometz tzom sasan. Both say this is what we saw before, that halacha l'mais. Rabbi Yossi says that you could take, remember again, if you had the barley kernels that began to open up, Rabbi Yossi says just soak them in vinegar, and vinegar causes it to contract. So once again, you see according to Rabbi Yossi that halacha l'mais, vinegar impedes the chimutz process, to which the Gemara says, Ki ashmu'inan le'le Rabbi Yossi, hani mili di'isi be'enei. Both say according to Rabbi Yossi, when is vinegar powerful enough to impede the chimutz process? That's only when the vinegar is by itself. Aval ayedei ta'aroves lo. But when the vinegar is mixed in with other things, then according to Rabbi Yossi, the vinegar does not have the ability to impede the chimutz process. So Rabbi say it's a machlokes in vinegar. Interestingly enough, a machlokes in the metzias in vinegar between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda. Both agree that vinegar has the ability and capacity to impede and prevent the chimutz process, but Rabbi Yossi says that's only when it's vinegar by itself. Rabbi Yehuda holds that halacha l'maisa, even if the vinegar is mixed in with something else. To which the Gemara says, Ula Amar, Ula said, Echad zavi, echad ze aser. The truth is, either way it's aser. Either way it's aser. And as I will say, ultimately, so Ula says, whether you're putting the vinegar in first or you're putting the vinegar in second, we don't introduce raw flour into food on Pesach. Why not? So the Gemara says, Mishum, l'cha min nazira, sechar lekarma. So I will say, this is the expression, or lech amin nazira, sechar lekarma. So I'll say, well, we tell the Nazir, just the imagery is, if you see a Nazir walking towards a vineyard, and he wants to take a shortcut through the vineyard, what do we tell the Nazir? Go around. Don't walk through the vineyard, go around the vineyard. But there's no problem with a Nazir walking through a vineyard. Right? At the end of the day, there's only a problem with him drinking, right? Consuming the grapes or the wine. To which the Gemara says, conventional wisdom is that when something is aser, stay away from it. So Ula says, we're not going to even enter into the issue regarding the use of raw flour in a cooked dish on Pesach, because that could only spell trouble. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, Ula says whether you're using vinegar or not using vinegar. Vinegar before the flour, vinegar after the flour. Either way, we don't do this on Pesach, ultimately, again, in order to avoid any kind of trouble. Rav Papa, Shari lebordiki de beireish galusa, lememcha kadera bechasisi. So this is very interesting. So Rav Papi allowed the bordiki, Rashi, the bordiki are the bakers. He allowed the bakers in the house of the Reish Galusa to go ahead and thicken a cooked dish bechasisi, with chasisi. And I will say chasisi is baked flour. So apparently Rav Papi felt that, listen, once the flour is baked, as we saw before, once an item is cooked, it is no longer subject to the chimutz process. See, he felt once it's baked, it's no problem to allow them to go ahead and put it in a pot of food which is cooking. So Amar Rava, so both said, but again, so I just want to be clear. Beforehand, we were talking about raw flour. Rav Papi felt that ultimately, again, with baked flour, it is not a problem to allow them to introduce it into the pot of cooked food. Amar Rava said, Ika deshari kiyai milsa beduchda deshchichi avdi. So Rava said, could it be that someone would permit this type of practice ultimately, again, in a place where there are servants? See, Rabbi saying, in general, avodim servants were not known to be exceptionally scrupulous or meticulous with halacha. So Rava is astounded that Rav Papi would allow the servants to do this, because it's asking for trouble. The servants are going to cut corners. You tell them baked flour, they may end up using a different kind of flour. So how could it be that halacha l'maisa Rav Papi would allow this? Ikeda Amri, others explain, Rava gufa machile kidra bechasisi. Others here both say what it was is Rava himself would go ahead and add the baked flour to the cooked dish. So I will say in this alternate version, Rava was against the use of servants because you can't trust them. But Rava felt if you're willing to do it yourself, right? You're willing to do it yourself, then ultimately, again, and you know that you could be meticulous and you could be careful with the type of flour that is mixed in, ensuring that it is only fully baked flour, then enachinami, that would not be a problem. Both say, generally, let me just use the 1 minute for halacha. I say this closes out the sugya. So both say, I sent you this halacha, this PDF of the Shulchan Aruch in the WhatsApp chat. And Rabbi said this is a very important halacha. Now, I'm going back now to the fact that the Gemara introduced us to the concept that matzos require shmira, right? Matzos require guarding. So we had a whole machlokas as exactly when the guarding, so to speak, has to begin. So the Shulchan Aruch Paskins, this is in Siman Taf Nun Gimel Sif Dalid. Shulchan Aruch says, Hachitim sha'osin bahen matzas mitzvah. The grain that is used to produce matzahs mitzvah, which are the matzos that you are going to use to satisfy your obligation on the night of the Seder, tov l'shomran shelo yiplu aleihem mayim mishas ketzira. Ideally, you want to guard them from the time that they are harvested. That's ideally what you want to do. You want to guard the grain from the time that it's harvested, that no water should go in and come in contact with the grain from this harvested. Ulefachos mishas tchina. And I will say at least from the time that the grain is ground into flour. So ideally, mishas ketzira, you want to guard it. Shmartem esalasos. You want to guard the wheat from coming in contact with liquid from the time that it's harvested. At least do it from the time, ultimately, again, that it is ground. But I will say, listen to this. Ubishas hadchak, but in a time of extenuating circumstance, mutar likach kamach min hashok. You could even purchase flour from the marketplace and go ahead and make your shmura matzah out of that, which means b'di'eved, as long as you guard the matzah mishas lisha, from the time of kneading. Ultimately, again, it is matzah that is usable for shmura matzah on the night of the Seder. Which I will say, just so you understand, all kidding aside, the reason why shmura matzah is so expensive, well, there's a variety of reasons. But remember, if you ever look on the box of your shmura matzah, what we today call shmura matzah is shmura mishas ketzira. It is guarded, the wheat itself is guarded, so to speak, it's guarded from the time of harvesting. You'll almost always see those words on the shmura matzah box itself. So we'll say, so again, because we use lechatchi the shmura matzah. B'di'evet, if you can't get it shmura mishas ktsira, at least mishas tchina, and b'shas hadchach, you could even buy flour in the supermarket and go ahead and use that to make shmura matzah. You would just go ahead and guard it. You would guard it from the time of the kneading and on. All right, we'll stop over, pick up Hashem at the Mishnah tomorrow.